Welcome back. We are now into week 8 of the figure sculpture course, and this week we're going to start to work on the portrait for our full figure. Okay, so I just wanted to show quickly a few portraits that I've done recently. This guy is Hephaestus, the smith god, and he was really constructed just from first principles of portraiture and understanding the skull, right? And so we're going to talk about a lot of these things in this lecture, mostly relating to our model and what we're going to be putting into our sculpture this week. But we'll touch on a lot of the critical forms that are important to the structure of a portrait and some of the soft tissue features that also make a portrait what it is and a likeness what it is. Okay. This was a couple years ago now, and I sculpted the face and the expressions for Medusa, and also the body and snakes, and quite a bit of things for her and other things in the film, Clash of the Titans. And this is actually one of the best stills. There was some good stuff, and there was a little bit of bad stuff for Medusa in the film, but I like this particular image. It shows a lot of good form in the face, and certainly when you're sculpting female faces, things become very subtle, and it becomes a very delicate balance of proportion and plane changes. Because there's not a lot of overt, especially on a beautiful woman, there's not a lot of overt wrinkles, muscles, plane changes, extreme plane changes. So it becomes a very delicate balance. Okay, kind of on the opposite end of the spectrum is something like this, which is it's kind of a caricature, but again, it follows a lot of the first principles of portraiture and construction. And you can see kind of when you have everything in the right kind of structure, in the kind of the right structural framework, then everything starts to look a little bit more believable. And this guy should turntable actually for us. So as he rotates around, you can see that, well, he's not believably human in any respect. He has a lot of kind of the defining characteristics that make somebody human, but just distorted. And that's kind of the secret to good caricature as well, is that you ground everything in reality, and then you distort, right? So if everything holds together, it should look like, wow, yeah, that's totally believable, but like nothing you've ever seen, right? So a lot of the structures of the skull and the soft tissue all link together correctly, but they're just in a ridiculous proportion, as well as his man boobs, which you don't really want to see something like that in real life if you can help it. Okay, so kind of the underlying foundation of this that makes for a successful portrait is the skull, right? And you guys need to know a lot about the skull. And if you come into a portrait and approach a portrait with very little knowledge of the underlying structure of the skull, something like this, then chances are you're going to be like this as you work through your portrait. Not very happy, right? Because things aren't going to fall into place when you don't have an understanding of the underpinning. However, if you come in with kind of a knowledge like this, all the critical planes and all the critical structures and inflections, then you'll be quite a bit happier. Quite a bit happier. This is like extreme happiness. This is as happy as you'll get. And so that's kind of why one of the things I prescribe to people on my portraiture workshops and portraiture courses is to study the skull, right? And really, you need to understand all these details in 3 dimensions. Certainly there's some room for simplification of the planes. This is quite in the round with all the nooks and crannies, but the more you understand, kind of the better off you'll be. I'll just go over a couple of the critical features. And we talked about some of these last week when we sketched in our portrait. Primarily, the thing that I want you guys to understand is the zygomatic arch, right? So think of this guy like a pair of sunglasses, except instead of sitting over the eyes and going over the ear, the little arm of the sunglasses goes back like this, and the front of the sunglasses is the front of this zygomatic bone right in here, and it sits right in here, right? And it's kind of a downward facing plane, and the tail goes back like this. this creates kind of the front plane of the face, right? And typically this is a deep depression, right? But people of different ages, young people especially, fill this in with fat, right? So you have a layer of fat that covers this whole area in here. So depending on youth and age, this area starts to get smoothed out and not as craggy as it seems here. However, kind of in advancing years, or depending on how lean you are, some of this fat kind of goes away and you start to see more of the bony structure of the corner of this zygomatic bone. Okay, next kind of constructional principle I want you guys to understand is the construction of the orbit, right? So if you have the top line of the zygomatic arch and you just bring it forward, I want you to understand that the orbit sits entirely above that line, right? So the cheekbone kind of establishes the bottom edge of the orbit. And we're looking at kind of a rectangular shape with kind of rounded inner corner and a rounded upper corner. Okay, typically, of course, this is filled in, and it's filled in with, well, to start, an eyeball, a roundish eyeball sits right in there, and that's covered with lids. Lids are quite difficult to sculpt and quite difficult to draw. I mean, eyes are where the magic of a portrait really is, so you have to get it correct. And you see as I'm drawing this that I'm kind of making two curves, one for the upper and one for the lower eye. But what I want you to notice is that when I make these curves for an eye, it's not perfectly symmetric, right? If we're talking about a high point in the upper curve, in the upper lid, it's probably 1/3 of the way in, if this is the middle of the orbit. The outer lid is 1/3 of the way on the outside, roughly. Varies from person to person, but that's kind of a general constructional principle to observe and look for differences in, right? So you guys are going to sit this in the eye, and then of course you're going to look for skin folds above, and we're looking at a very specific reference. So all of this stuff should be fairly straightforward for you to resolve. It just becomes a question of dexterity and technique in ZBrush to resolve this. Okay. Now above the orbit, so normally this is soft, it filled in with fat. Fat is everywhere in the face, by the way. Fat makes the face what it is. Fat and bony structure. And then third, of course, is cartilage, which is like the nose. And last is probably muscle, right? So people who are all about the facial muscles for form, you're barking up the wrong tree, because facial muscles, all the muscles of expression that you see people at crochet, they create minimal surface form, right? It's all to do with fat, the skull, skeleton, and cartilage. Okay, on the upper bit of the orbit, I want you guys to look at these two little bony prominences. They're called superciliary arches, and they kind of spiral up like this, like teardrop shapes sitting above here, and they're kind of bony projections. And this is a very male characteristic, right? Somebody's very kind of masculine, these get more and more pronounced. It's kind of a feature of kind of testosterone, right? More testosterone you have, the bigger these things become. And you'll notice on people, they look like a big kind of prominent brow. Also notice kind of structurally the frontal bone sits up here as a kind of a prominence and kind of recedes to the side. And where it recedes to the side, it starts to pick up as you're rolling over the edge, what's known as the temporal line, right? And this is really a big plane change on the face that you guys need to look for. We have a plane coming off like this, which is the kind of the frontal bone rolling back, and then it transitions into the side plane, which is where a muscle called the temporalis sits. Right, the temporalis just sits in here, fills this out, and it's one of our chewing muscles. right? But this line is important, and you look for that coming off the outer upper corner of the orbit when you're working on a portrait, right? And establishing the critical structure of the skull. Okay, the last kind of critical thing relating to this to the skull is to do with the nasal bone, right? The nasal bone projects out at this angle or whatever angle it takes, right? This is a very individual thing, and it helps to establish part of the nose in the profile. So this is a very important angle to look for, as is things like the angle of the frontal bone, the prominence of this, this inflection back here, primarily in portrait, and we'll see, or in a profile, and we'll see that in a minute. But the nasal bone is kind of a strong feature, and you'll look for this, and it kind of sets up more or less the angle of the nose coming off of the skull. And it's bone up here and cartilage down here, right? I'm going to leave the details of all the cartilage construction for another course, because that gets quite involved and it can take many different forms. But we'll see a little bit of me sculpting the nose in the time-lapse videos in the working example. Okay, so cartilage fills in here, great. Bone out here, zygomatic arch, fantastic. Orbit, superciliary arches, frontal bone. Below this, we're pretty much talking about soft tissue and soft structures down here. So kind of beneath the zygomatic arch going down, all this is formed by fat, skin, a little bit of facial muscles, filling out some of the forms in the lip, and big chewing muscle in here called the masseter, right? But primarily, once you get below the zygomatic arch, you're not looking at bony structure on the surface. You're looking at kind of all the soft forms. Okay, and now let's just take a quick look at the skull in 3D. Okay, in ZBrush, I have a skull in front of me, and this is a scan of a cast of a real skull, right? So it's fairly accurate to one person somewhere in the world when they were alive. And of course, there's as many variations in skulls as there are faces of people in the world. So if this one is a little funny in some respects, it's because somebody in the world was a little bit funny in some particular feature when they were alive. But I just want to give you guys a quick look around this, because I showed it in kind of in the front and side view in the lecture, but I just want you guys to appreciate some of the three-dimensional aspects as I just kind of tour around. Right, so zygomatic arch is here, right, and the zygomatic bone, you see why it's called an arch, right? Because this is a big space in here for that muscle that we talked about, the temporalis, to pass through. Temporalis sits up here, kind of in this side plane. If I move my light around, you'll be able to see where this changes plane. Look at that temporal line, and right in here, the temporal fossa is where the temporal muscle sits, right? It comes down and grabs onto this little bony section of the jaw, the mandible down here. Okay, helps you chew. The next thing, kind of on the bottom edge of the zygomatic arch, this space is filled in by the masseter, right? So your other big chewing muscle kind of comes from this angle down here and inserts, originates more exactly from the underside of the zygomatic arch right there. Okay, just look at the kind of sunglasses that I talked about, right? So you have the little stick of them going back, whatever you want to call that, the little band, and then the front plane here. Notice it's a little bit of a downward facing plane. So downward facing, and bordered above, of course, by the lower margin of the orbit. Orbit, like I said, has kind of a nice rectangular feature, but has this nice gesture coming up the inside, which you'll recognize in many of the furrows coming off the inner corner of the eye, right? We have furrows that align themselves with this margin. So keep an eye out for that. Superciliary arches are up here. Just like I said, these are kind of a testosterone feature, a very male characteristic. Women, in their most feminine sense, don't have these. As women become more masculine, they can start to develop some of those. If you see female bodybuilders who've taken a lot of steroids, they start to get things like this. Okay, nasal bone. Not much to say there except for this nasal bone, kind of the aperture, establishes pretty much the width of the nose, right? The wider the nasal aperture in the skeleton, in the skull, the wider somebody's nose will be. And typically the nostrils start outside by about a couple millimeters wider than the aperture. And they do a very mechanical thing. They funnel air into the nose, right? In the side view, just quickly appreciate how little of the head is face, right? In fact, the majority of it is the cranium, right? So if you divide the cranium in half down the middle, you kind of go through the ear hole right here, and then you have this big block in the back. This is where sternocleidomastoid comes from, the mastoid process. Right behind the ear. Everybody reach behind your ear as you sit in your desks or wherever watching this and feel the big mastoid process there. It literally sits right against the cup of the back of your ear. Or for people who are into that stuff, the concha is the name of that little cup at the back of the ear. Okay, so just really appreciate that the face down here hangs off of this large egg shape in profile, right? So people characteristically give too much importance, visual importance, to the face, just because it's what we attend to as humans. It's kind of built in. It's human nature to look at the face and look at expressions. Artistically, we have to fight that because we never make the back big enough, and we always make the face too big. Okay. Beyond that, I think probably maybe the last important thing is the bottom of the jaw in the inferior aspect. So looking up, you kind of just see the shape of it. Again, this varies person to person and is an individual thing, but it's just going to be like deforming this shape, right? So when you get to sculpting the underside of somebody's jaw, you're not making a big square or a big rectangle or a tiny point of a diamond. You're making kind of a big bowed shape. And remember, the chin is mostly fat, right? There's a huge kind of deposit of fat that sits on the chin that really bulks this out, right? So this little bony point that we had there is really encased in fat. Again, feel it for yourself. Everybody sit there and start grabbing the fat on your chin. No matter how lean and athletic you are, or the opposite, you'll have just a big fatty knob on top of the bone. Okay, that is the 2-cent tour of the skull in 3 dimensions, right? And so most of this is going to be encased in soft tissue down here, but just really appreciate the bony structure from about this level up. And look at that little arrow right on his forehead. Okay, and now we'll just go back to the lecture. Okay, and now the important muscles of the face, right? So we talked about kind of the skull and zygomatic arch and all this stuff in here. But what's important as far as musculature goes in relation to surface form are the 2 muscles that I kind of alluded to. The masseter, which kind of sits down here, and the temporalis, which is kind of covered, you can see, by temporal fascia. If you need to know what temporal fascia is, you can look it up, but essentially it's kind of a big fibrous packing, kind of big fibrous stocking that surrounds the body. In this case, is packing in the temporalis muscle, which sits in here, right, and just kind of fills in the temporal fossa. Okay, I'm not going to cover all these. I mean, these are equally important muscles, but for expressions, and and that's a big topic and something to be covered more in detail in a portraiture course, right? We're going to not really touch on expressions, so I just wanted to cover the skeletal muscles because these guys, while important to expression, are so small and thin that they don't create a ton of surface form. There's minor exceptions, but for the most part, you see these guys via the expressions that they make. Okay, now going forward, when you're sculpting your portrait, I want you guys to just know that the profile is king. To the point where when I was studying kind of very traditional sculpture, you just roll out a very flat sheet of clay and literally stick it on your armature, and you would be just pretty much drawing a portrait and cutting it out of this thin slice of clay. And then you would literally rotate around to the front and fill in the front view and start to fill in all this stuff. But portrait, or the profile, is a very distinct lineup that gives you a benchmark or a baseline off which to construct the rest of the face, right? This is your datum. You know, it's a freebie if you get it established well early on. It's not as simple as just drawing it, unfortunately, in 3D, but you can always rotate your model into profile, compare it against a reference of the figure in profile, and really get a lot of the character of the person just from their profile, right? And it ends up being a combination of things, right? The character of a person can be established by the line of the front of the skull, the frontal bone, kind of how deep this depression goes and at what angle. The nose, you can refine this kind of line into a lot of subtle details. As you look deeper and deeper, you can get a bunch of plane changes here, or not. Right, that's another characteristic. You'll have the angle of the underside of the nose. So what direction does this go in? Kind of more flat here, a little bit pointing up here. The upper lip, does it bow out or does it go vertically down? This one has a little extra gesture here. And then in, what's the angle of the lower lip? You know, all these considerations make a portrait. And then, of course, chin. And then the angle from the chin back to the neck. How far is it, right? And this guy's kind of head conforms pretty well to general proportions. Andrew is a little bit tall. He's taller rather than he is wide, right? So one of the things that you'll see in the working example is me really refining this proportion to conform it to the height of the skull, right? Because this is a relatively tall face compared to kind of your average, which would look something like this. Okay, so that's the main thing I wanted to cover here was the characteristic angles of the face and how important the profile is. Beyond that, the things you want to look for are the spacing between, say, the frontal bone where it turns back, which could be right about here, to center of the eyebrows roughly. This little change, this little bone here, it's called the glabella, the space between the eyebrows. So in an average person, these are kind of rules of thirds. 1/3, 1/3, 1/3. Forehead to eyebrow, eyebrow to bottom of the nose, bottom of the nose to bottom of the chin, right? So if you're looking at somebody, you're kind of varying those proportions off of this average, right? In this case, Andrew has a very tall space from lower nose to lower chin. The other two are fairly equal, nose and forehead. Okay, then within this bottom third, you're looking at thirds for the mouth. So if you divide this into thirds, the part of the lip should sit at 1/3, and then you should have 2/3 down here. And that's, again, just an average, and it seems to hold true there. Okay, so profile is king. Beyond that, you guys are starting to construct soft features, right? And soft features are the forms of the nose. And I'm going to leave you guys to observe these and to kind of follow what I do in the working example. So you have a lot of cartilage there. You have furrows that arise in these areas. Remember, I said look carefully at the skull, and you noticed this inner margin of the orbit. That gives rise to this furrow, which is called the infraorbital furrow. You have another furrow down here, which is very characteristic on our model, called the nasolabial furrow. So you want to pay careful attention to that. I want you guys to look at this right above the nasolabial furrow. You know, the fat in this cheekbone here. Right, here's the zygomatic arch coming across. You have this plane here, and then you have fat in here. So pay attention to the shape of that. Lips are very characteristic, and he has very kind of expressive lips, right? It's not a line straight across, but there's a lot of gesture to him. So look closely at those lines. You know, you've got this little dip at the tail. And as you look through the reference, you always have to be conscious of whether somebody is pulling an expression or if they're in fact neutral. And it looks like he has a tiny bit of a smirk on here, just a tiny bit, which is giving a little lift up here. Beyond that, I want you guys to notice this guy. There's a little bit of convexity sitting on the corner of the mouth. Again, we'll cover the anatomy of this more in a portraiture course, but I'll just point out the forms in this lecture. And moving up, kind of characteristic things on the eyes. The eye cover fold. Look at the upper lid fold here. It really goes over the upper lid, right? So you're going to have to do some sculpting here. And again, look between all the reference images provided and see how you want to treat that. And then lower lid as well. There are some convexities here and some wrinkles. Be gentle with them. Don't over-model them because it's easy to over-model these kind of things. But if you set it up properly with plane changes, then they should look good. Superciliary arches. I mentioned those on the skeleton. Andrew has some fairly prominent ones. And almost an etched-in furrow going down in between here. He's not especially frowning, but it just looks like that because he's hard. Okay, that's the majority of the soft tissue. You'll see me work through all this stuff in the working example, so you'll see how I kind of place it, and it's not easy at all. This is probably the hardest thing to do because one, a likeness is incredibly difficult to achieve. And you know, it's sometimes very small things that throw it off, and it's a process of refining and then refining your vision and coming back and looking at it another day and just kind of iterating. And you get more and more practice and start to see more and more subtleties in the plane changes and the inflection, and hopefully you'll start to learn some of the construction as well. Okay. So yeah, there's a lot of reference available to you this week for portrait stuff. And this is where we're headed, right? So this week we're going to build up our guy from base mesh or whatever we started with, wherever we left him last week. And we're going to get to somewhere around here over the next week. And the hair, I go through it in the working example. There'll be a separate video kind of on sculpting hair. This is just really a quick block-in to make him not bald, because you don't want him to be bald in your images because his hair is a large component of the proportions of his head in our reference. So you want to block in the volume of that. Okay, so I will see you guys in the working example. But I think you guys know where we're going this week, and you have your work cut out for you. So good luck. And get sculpting.